I am writing this with hands that officially never fought in the battles I'm about to describe, serving in legions that records claim were never deployed to the worlds I'll name, participating in campaigns that every archive in the Imperium insists never occurred. My service history, which should span 200 years and 47 major engagements, has been reduced to a single line in the Administratum's personnel files: veteran, unassigned, status, observational, no legion designation, no battle honors, no company affiliations or squad compositions, just that clinical notation suggesting I've spent 2 centuries doing nothing but watching, which is almost funny because watching is exactly what I've been doing, watching the records disappear, watching my brothers vanish from roster lists, watching entire campaigns be systematically deleted from existence, as if the Imperium could erase truth by destroying evidence. But I remember. That's my crime and my burden, and possibly my madness. I remember Cartes the Seventh, where we lost 4,000 Astartes in 6 hours. I remember the Gaharis compliance, where 3 entire companies were rendered combat ineffective before we even understood what we were fighting. I remember Savaven, Moloch's Gate, the Whisper Worlds, and 24 other battlefields, whose names now return 0 results when searched through any Imperial database, whose coordinates have been scrubbed from navigation charts, whose very existence has been denied so thoroughly that mentioning them marks you for attention from forces you don't want noticing your presence. I discovered the erasure 9 years ago, though the process had certainly been underway long before I noticed it. I'd been assigned to the Fortress of Vigilance on Calth's secondary moon, a posting that I'd initially considered punishment detail. Watching training simulations and assessing neophyte performance is not work that veteran line Astartes typically receive unless they've done something to disappoint their commanders. But I came to understand that the posting was strategic, was intended to keep me far from active combat zones, far from positions where my memories might contaminate younger brothers who'd been indoctrinated after the erasure protocols began. The discovery happened during a routine review of Legion histories. I'd been tasked with developing tactical scenarios based on historical engagements, creating training simulations that would prepare neophytes for the realities of warfare across various environmental conditions. Standard procedure. I accessed the archive cogitators and began searching for the Cartes the Seventh campaign, intending to extract tactical data about urban warfare in high radiation environments. The cogitator returned an error message. No records found matching specified parameters. I assumed equipment malfunction, tried alternative search terms: Cartes system, 7th planet, radiation world compliance. Each query returned the same result: no records found. I expanded the search to my Legion's complete campaign history, expecting to see hundreds of entries spanning 2 centuries of conquest and compliance actions. The cogitator displayed 47 engagements, not 47,000 or 4,700, 47 total campaigns, which was approximately 1/5 of what I personally remembered participating in, which meant someone had deleted roughly 80% of my Legion's operational history. I reported the discrepancy to the archive magus. He listened with appropriate attention, made appropriate notations, assured me he would investigate the data corruption. 3 days later, I received summons to the Fortress Commandant's quarters. Commander Hellas, a veteran who'd served since before my induction, regarded me with an expression I'd rarely seen on Astartes' features: pity mixed with resignation. "Brother," he said, which itself was unusual because we typically used rank designations rather than fraternal address, "I need you to stop searching for battles that the Administratum cannot locate in official records. Sir, these weren't obscure skirmishes. Cartes the Seventh alone cost us 4,000. The Administratum has no record of any Cartes the Seventh campaign. Neither does the Collegia Titanica, the Imperial Navy, or any other organization that would have supported such an operation. If the records don't exist, then neither did the battles. You are remembering incorrectly, conflating different engagements, or suffering from combat-induced memory distortion. These things happen, especially to veterans of your tenure. Accept the discrepancy and move forward." But I knew my memories were accurate. Could recall specific details, the smell of ionized air from the radiation storms, the particular orange tint of Cartes VII's atmosphere, the weight of the specialized armor we'd worn to survive the environmental conditions. Could remember brothers who'd fallen there, their names and faces, and the exact circumstances of their deaths. Could remember the enemy we'd fought, though that's where the memories started to feel strange, started to develop qualities that made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't initially articulate. I began documenting everything I could remember, creating personal files hidden in my quarters rather than stored in any official system. Campaign names, dates, force compositions, tactical summaries. I filled data slates with details, obsessively recording every fragment of memory before it could be lost or corrupted or systematically erased like the official histories. And as I wrote, I noticed patterns that disturbed me more than the erasure itself. The forgotten battles shared certain characteristics. They were uniformly costly casualty rates far exceeding typical compliance actions, with losses that would have devastated Legion strength if acknowledged. They occurred in regions of space that navigation charts now showed as empty void or unexplored territory, despite my clear memories of planetary assaults and orbital bombardments. And most disturbing, the enemies we'd fought in these battles didn't match any Xenos classification in the Imperium's comprehensive bestiary, didn't correspond to known threats, didn't fit into any category that should have required Space Marine deployment. I started carefully questioning other veterans, probing their memories without revealing my own concerns. Most couldn't remember the battles I referenced, looked at me with confusion when I mentioned world names that should have been burned into their consciousness alongside the casualties we'd suffered. But occasionally, perhaps one conversation in 20, I'd see recognition flicker across a brother's face, see them understand what I was asking and then deliberately shut down, refusing to engage, changing the subject with a transparency that confirmed they remembered but had chosen silence. One veteran, Brother Cassius, pulled me aside after I'd mentioned Savaven during a training review. He waited until we were alone in the simulation bay, then spoke in a voice so low I barely heard him despite enhanced hearing. Stop asking questions about battles that don't exist. Stop trying to remember what we've been ordered to forget. There are reasons for the erasure. Good reasons. Necessary reasons. We fought things on those worlds that shouldn't be possible, encountered threats that violate fundamental principles of reality. The Imperium deleted the records because acknowledging what happened would be more dangerous than pretending it never occurred. What did we fight? I pressed. What was so terrible that it required erasing entire campaigns from history? His expression shifted, became distant, haunted in ways that Astartes' features shouldn't accommodate. I don't remember. Or I remember but can't articulate it. Or I'm remembering wrong, reconstructing false histories from trauma and confusion. That's what they told me during the conditioning. That's what I chose to believe because the alternative meant accepting that we'd failed, that we'd encountered enemies we couldn't defeat through superior tactics or firepower or faith, that the Imperium's greatest warriors had been rendered ineffective by forces we couldn't comprehend, let alone combat. He refused to discuss it further. But his confirmation mattered. I wasn't mad or confused or suffering from memory distortion. The battles had happened. Others remembered. And something about those engagements had frightened the Imperium badly enough to warrant systematic historical revisionism on a scale I'd never imagined possible. I began investigating the other patterns I'd noticed. The casualty rates first. If the forgotten battles had cost as many Astartes as I remembered, then the legions should be dramatically under strength compared to official rosters. I accessed personnel databases, cross-referenced force compositions against battle reports, attempted to track individual warriors through their service histories, and I discovered something impossible. The legions maintained full strength despite the losses I remembered. 4,000 casualties at Cartes VII should have devastated our numbers, yet our legion showed no corresponding reduction in combat-ready Astartes, which meant either my memories were wrong about the scale of losses, or the Imperium was replacing casualties faster than should be possible, or something else was happening that violated my understanding of how Legion logistics functioned. I couldn't determine which explanation was correct, but all of them troubled me, because they suggested either my own unreliability or systematic deception at levels that implied conspiracy rather than administrative error. The second pattern involved the locations themselves. I started mapping the worlds where forgotten battles had occurred, plotting their coordinates based on my memories, and attempting to correlate them with current navigation data. What I discovered made no sense. Many of the worlds didn't exist anymore, not destroyed or rendered lifeless, simply absent from space, where I clearly remembered them existing. Cartes VII should occupy a specific orbital position in its system, but current surveys showed only empty void at those coordinates. Saverven should be the fourth planet orbiting a red giant, but that star had only 3 planets, according to every chart I could access. It was as if the battles had occurred in territories that were subsequently deleted from reality itself, not just from records but from physical existence, and that suggested something far stranger than bureaucratic cover-up or historical revisionism. That suggested the erasure went deeper than I'd imagined, affected more than just data, implied forces capable of altering reality at fundamental levels that my training had never prepared me to consider. I found Hook's journal during a routine sweep of deceased veterans' effects. Brother Hook had served in my company centuries ago, had fallen during the Gaharis compliance, one of the forgotten battles, or at least that's what I remembered. But according to official records, Hook had died during a void combat operation in an entirely different sector, his death thoroughly documented with appropriate honors and memoriam services. The contradiction troubled me enough to request access to his personal effects, which had been stored rather than distributed because he'd had no living family to receive them. Among his possessions, I found a data slate encoded with a cipher I recognized from our shared service. When I decrypted it, I discovered extensive notes documenting his growing awareness of the erasure, his attempts to preserve memories that official histories denied. But his notes went further than mine, explored implications I'd been avoiding, suggested conclusions that made me wish I'd never started investigating. Hook had been tracking disappearances, not combat casualties but veterans who'd vanished from service rosters without explanation, their names deleted from personnel files, their quarters reassigned, their existence erased as thoroughly as the battles they'd fought. He'd documented 43 such disappearances across multiple legions, all of them veterans of forgotten engagements, all of them erased after they'd begun asking questions about discrepancies in official histories. And he'd noted a pattern. The disappearances accelerated whenever someone got close to understanding what we'd actually fought during those erased campaigns. His final entry, dated 3 days before his official death, read, "I understand now why they're deleting the records. It's not to hide our failures or protect morale or maintain operational security. It's because the enemy we fought doesn't fit into categories the Imperium can acknowledge. We didn't fight Xenos or heretics or rebels. We fought ourselves, or versions of ourselves, or something that wore our faces and spoke with our voices and knew our tactics with impossible familiarity." Cartes VII wasn't a compliance action, it was civil war against forces that shouldn't exist. Brothers fighting brothers who'd never been born, legions battling mirror images of themselves across battlefields that existed in states of quantum uncertainty. The Imperium is erasing the records, because acknowledging what happened would mean confronting the possibility that reality itself is unstable, that multiple timelines or dimensions or whatever terminology the tech priests prefer are leaking into each other, that we're fighting wars against versions of ourselves from realities where different choices led to different outcomes. I read that entry 17 times, hoping each reading would reveal it as madness or metaphor or trauma-induced delusion. But Hook had been among the most stable battle brothers I'd known, had possessed a clarity of thought and precision of memory that made him exceptional, even among Astartes. If he'd reached these conclusions, if he'd been disappeared shortly after recording them, then either he'd been correct and paid the price for that correctness, or the Imperium was eliminating anyone who approached these particular truths, regardless of their validity. The dreams started after I'd read Hook's journal. Not dreams exactly. Astartes sleep differently than baseline humans. Our rest cycles mediated by catalepsy and node implants that should prevent conventional dreaming. But I began experiencing something during dormancy periods, something that felt like memories bleeding through from adjacent states of consciousness, visions of battles that were simultaneously familiar and impossible. I dreamed of Cartes VII, but in the dreams I was fighting against my own legion rather than alongside them. Watched myself or some version of myself leading an assault against positions I remembered defending, using tactics I'd developed, knowing exactly how I'd respond, because the enemy commander thought with my mind and predicted with my experience. The dreams showed me killing brothers, whose names I knew, whose faces matched personnel files exactly, whose combat patterns reflected training I'd participated in. And they showed me being killed by versions of myself, iterations of my consciousness that existed in quantum superposition, all fighting simultaneously across a battlefield that occupied multiple states of reality. The dreams revealed what Hook had discovered. We hadn't fought Xenos on the Forgotten Worlds. We'd fought ourselves, or rather, we'd fought iterations of ourselves, bleeding through from parallel realities, from timelines where the Imperium had made different choices, or encountered different threats, or developed along divergent paths. The ruinous powers weren't involved, or weren't the primary force. This was something else, something the Imperium's cosmology couldn't accommodate, something that suggested the universe was far stranger and more unstable than even our most esoteric philosophies acknowledged. And the casualty rates made sense finally. 4,000 Astartes lost at Cartes VII weren't actually lost, they were dispersed, scattered across multiple realities, continuing to exist, but no longer anchored to our specific timeline. They fought in those adjacent realities, served in those parallel Imperiums, lived and died in quantum states that made conventional notions of death or survival meaningless. The legions maintained full strength because for every brother lost to dimensional dispersion, another iteration from a different timeline bled through to replace them, creating net stability even as individual warriors flickered between realities. I realized I might not be the original iteration of myself, might be a version that had replaced the primary consciousness, inheriting memories that belonged to other timelines, experiencing continuity across quantum states that should have been discrete. The thought was destabilizing in ways I couldn't articulate, suggesting that identity itself was negotiable, that the I, thinking these thoughts, might be a composite of dozens or hundreds of iterations, all occupying the same physical space, flickering between states, too rapidly for consciousness to distinguish individual transitions. Brother Cassius disappeared 3 days after our conversation. Not killed in combat, simply erased from personnel rosters, his quarters cleared, his service history deleted. I tried to inquire about his whereabouts, and was told by the fortress commandant that no one matching his description had ever served in our company, that I was confused about names or had conflated multiple individuals into a single false memory. But I had physical evidence of his existence, equipment he'd loaned me, messages he'd sent, shared experiences that involved other witnesses who should remember him. When I mentioned those witnesses to the commandant, he looked at me with that same expression of pity and resignation I'd seen before. Brother, you need to stop investigating anomalies in personnel records. You need to accept that memory is unreliable, especially for veterans who've served as long as you. The conditioning we receive, the neural augmentations, the combat stimulants, they all accumulate neurological effects over centuries. What you remember as individual people might be composite constructs, fictional personalities your mind created to make sense of fragmented data. Brother Cassius doesn't exist because he never existed. Accept this and move forward. But I knew Cassius had existed, could remember specific conversations, shared battles, his particular combat style, and the way he maintained his war gear. Could remember him pulling me aside and warning me about the forgotten battles, confirming that others remembered the erasure. and his disappearance immediately following that conversation suggested I was being monitored, that something or someone was tracking my investigation and eliminating witnesses who confirmed my memories. I discovered the archive 3 months later, during a maintenance inspection of the fortress's lower levels. These were spaces that hadn't been occupied in centuries, subterranean chambers sealed after the facility's initial construction and forgotten by current administration. I'd been assigned to verify structural integrity before potential renovation work, a routine task that required accessing areas few personnel ever visited. And in the deepest levels, behind sealed doors marked with warnings in languages that predated the Imperium, I found chambers containing data storage systems that official inventories claimed didn't exist. The systems were ancient, predating even Crusade-era equipment that our tech priests maintained with religious devotion, but they were active, powered by sources I couldn't identify, maintaining vast databases that hummed with the particular resonance of heavily loaded cogitator banks. I accessed the systems carefully, expecting security protocols or machine spirit resistance. Instead, the systems opened immediately, granted me full access as if they'd been waiting for exactly this inquiry, and displayed catalogs of information that official archives insisted had been permanently destroyed. The forgotten battles were all there. Complete records, deployment orders, tactical summaries, casualty lists, after-action reports from commanders who'd officially never led the campaigns described in their accounts. I found Cortes VII documentation showing exactly what I remembered: 4,000 Astartes lost, massive enemy resistance, victory achieved at catastrophic cost. I found Geharis compliance records, confirming 3 companies rendered combat ineffective. I found Savavan, Moloch's Gate, the Whisper Worlds, and every other battle the Imperium had systematically deleted from accessible archives. But I also found something else. Alongside each campaign record, I discovered classified assessments marked with clearance levels I'd never seen before, bearing authorization codes that suggested involvement from the highest levels of Imperial command. These assessments didn't describe our victories or tactical successes. They described containment operations, reality stabilization protocols, dimensional anchor deployments. They described what we'd actually fought during those erased engagements. The Cortes VII assessment confirmed Hook's conclusions. We'd fought ourselves iterations of our own legion bleeding through from parallel timelines, armed with identical equipment, employing familiar tactics, knowing our capabilities because they possessed the same capabilities. But the assessment went further, explained that Cortes VII existed in a state of quantum flux, occupied a position where multiple realities intersected, where the boundaries between timelines had degraded to the point that versions of the same events played out simultaneously across different probability streams. The Imperium's response hadn't been to conquer Cortes VII, but to collapse its quantum state, forcing reality to resolve into a single definite outcome. The 4,000 casualties we'd suffered hadn't died. They'd been distributed across multiple timelines as probability waves collapsed, each warrior existing in superposition until the resolution forced them into specific states. Some remained in our timeline, others dispersed to alternatives, but all of them continued existing somewhere, fighting battles that were simultaneously the same engagement and completely different conflicts. And the planet itself had been erased, not destroyed but removed from reality entirely, deleted from causality so thoroughly that it had never existed in any timeline. The space where Cortes VII should occupy was just void now. Empty coordinates that had always been empty, would always be empty, because the Imperium had deployed weapons or technologies or psyker abilities capable of retroactively editing reality itself. I found similar assessments for every forgotten battle. Geharis had been another quantum intersection. Savavan existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Moloch's Gate served as an anchor point where parallel Imperiums overlapped and bled into each other. The Whisper Worlds were exactly what their name suggested, places where realities whispered to each other across dimensional boundaries, sharing information and forces and consequences that should have remained separate. The Imperium was fighting a secret war, not against Xenos or heretics or any acknowledged threat, but against reality's instability itself, against the fundamental uncertainty at the heart of existence, against the possibility that everything we thought was solid and definite was actually probability distributions that could be influenced or manipulated or collapsed into different states. And they were erasing the records, because acknowledging these battles would mean acknowledging that reality was negotiable, that history could be rewritten, that the universe operated according to principles that violated everything the imperial truth claimed about objective reality and materialist philosophy. The casualties we'd suffered weren't losses in any conventional sense. They were reality adjustments, probability redistributions, quantum corrections that maintained overall stability even as individual warriors flickered between states. The legions maintained full strength because for every brother lost to dimensional dispersion, another iteration from a parallel timeline was stabilized into our reality, creating conservation of force across the multiverse. We were simultaneously fighting battles and being fought by ourselves, existing in superposition until external observation collapsed our probability waves into definite states. I understood why the Imperium was erasing these records. Because acknowledging the truth would destabilize everything, would mean confronting the possibility that the Emperor's unification of terror might have occurred differently in adjacent timelines, that the Crusade might be succeeding in some realities and failing in others, that our victories were offset by our defeats across probability distributions that made conventional notions of winning or losing meaningless, would mean accepting that we were fighting wars across infinite battlefields simultaneously, that every choice created branches that required stabilization, that reality itself was a contested territory requiring constant management. And it would mean confronting the possibility that we weren't the prime timeline, weren't the original or definite or most stable version of events, that we might be a quantum fluctuation ourselves, a probability distribution that had temporarily achieved coherence but could collapse back into superposition at any moment, dispersing into parallel realities where different versions of ourselves continued the same struggles toward different outcomes. The archive contained one final document that confirmed my worst fears, a memo from the highest levels of Imperial command, addressed to Legion commanders, dated approximately when the erasures began. It explained that dimensional instabilities had been detected at increasing frequency, that the boundaries between timelines were degrading across multiple sectors, that conflicts involving quantum duplicates of Imperial forces were becoming common enough to threaten operational security and morale. The memo outlined a solution: systematic historical revision, delete all records of battles against quantum duplicates, eliminate documentation of reality fluctuations, suppress knowledge of dimensional instabilities, and most critically, terminate any personnel who demonstrated awareness of these phenomena, because such awareness itself could act as an observation that collapsed beneficial probability states, could influence quantum outcomes through consciousness-mediated reality adjustments that the Imperium couldn't control. Hook had been terminated. Cassius had been terminated. 43 veterans that Hook had documented had been terminated. And I was next. The moment I'd accessed these archives, the moment I'd read these assessments, the moment I'd understood what the forgotten battles actually represented, I'd marked myself for elimination. Not killed. Exactly. Erased. Dispersed across timelines until I existed in so many states simultaneously that no single iteration could maintain coherent identity. Deleted from reality as thoroughly as the battles I'd fought. Removed from causality so completely that I'd never existed in any definite sense. I began noticing the signs immediately after leaving the archive. Reality felt unstable around me, flickering between states too rapidly to consciously perceive, but noticeable in peripheral awareness. Corridors seemed to shift length when I wasn't looking directly at them. Personnel I knew appeared and disappeared from roster lists between queries. My own reflection in polished surfaces occasionally showed variations, different scars, different armor configurations, different rank that I'd never achieved or had achieved in timelines adjacent to this one. The conditioning sessions started 3 days later. Mandatory psychological evaluation, they called it. Standard procedure for veterans showing signs of combat fatigue or memory distortion. But I knew what they really were. Attempts to delete my memories of the archive, to erase my understanding of the forgotten battles, to force me back into ignorance of quantum realities before I could act on that knowledge in ways that destabilized beneficial probability distributions. The conditioning failed, or partially failed, or worked in some timelines while failing in others, creating superposition where I simultaneously remembered and didn't remember, existed in states where I'd been successfully conditioned and states where I'd resisted. The tech priests conducting the sessions seemed confused by my results, frustrated by data that showed both complete memory erasure and perfect retention simultaneously, as if I existed in multiple states that should have been mutually exclusive. I realized I was becoming quantum myself. The knowledge I'd gained, the awareness of reality's instability, the understanding of how the Imperium managed dimensional conflicts, all of it was influencing my own coherence, degrading the boundaries that defined me as a singular entity anchored to a specific timeline. I could feel myself dispersing, consciousness fragmenting across parallel realities, existing in states where I'd been successfully terminated, and states where I'd escaped, and states where I'd never investigated the erasures in the first place. And in those fragmentary moments of distributed awareness, I perceived the scope of the secret war. Thousands of forgotten battles, not dozens. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, not thousands. Multiple legions not just damaged but effectively destroyed across probability distributions that official rosters denied through creative accounting and quantum replacement. The Imperium bleeding strength across infinite timelines, hemorrhaging warriors into dimensional voids, maintaining apparent stability through mathematical tricks that average successful outcomes across the multiverse, while ignoring catastrophic failures in adjacent realities. I saw versions of myself fighting on worlds I'd never heard of, against enemies that wore my face. Saw iterations of my brothers dying in battles that would never be recorded, victories that would never be celebrated, defeats that would never be acknowledged. Saw the Imperium stretched across quantum states, like fabric pulled too thin, held together only through willful ignorance and systematic historical revision, denying the truth about reality's instability, because acknowledging that truth would collapse probability distributions that currently favored human survival. The Emperor knew. That's what I understood in my quantum distributed state. The Emperor had always known. The entire crusade was designed not just to unite humanity, but to stabilize reality itself, to collapse quantum fluctuations into definite states favorable to human existence, to anchor timelines that might otherwise diverge into probabilities where humanity failed, or never existed, or evolved along paths that led to extinction. Every compliance wasn't just conquering worlds, but forcing reality to resolve into specific configurations. Every battle wasn't just defeating enemies but collapsing probability waves into observable outcomes that reinforced the timeline we inhabited. And the forgotten battles were failures. Not military defeats but quantum collapses that went wrong, probability distributions that resolved into states the Imperium couldn't control, realities that had to be excised from history because acknowledging them would destabilize the entire structure. The erasure wasn't cover-up but necessary reality management, deleting information that acted as observation, that collapsed beneficial quantum states through consciousness-mediated effects the tech priests barely understood. I don't know which version of me is writing this, don't know if I'm the iteration that successfully resisted conditioning or one of dozens of fragments existing in superposition, documenting experiences that happened in different timelines simultaneously. Don't know if this testimony will survive or be erased like everything else, deleted from records before anyone can read it, removed from causality so thoroughly that the act of writing it never occurred in any definite sense. But I'm writing it anyway, because someone needs to remember. Someone needs to document what the Imperium is hiding, what we've fought, what we've lost across quantum battlefields that official histories claim never existed. Someone needs to acknowledge the veterans who've been erased, the brothers who've been dispersed across timelines, the warriors who continue fighting in realities adjacent to ours while their service in this reality is systematically denied. The forgotten battles destroyed the legions, not through conventional casualties but through quantum dispersion, through probability redistributions that scattered us across infinite timelines, through reality adjustments that deleted us from causality when our experiences threatened to destabilize beneficial probability states. We fought ourselves and lost ourselves and became ourselves in configurations that violated identity's coherence. We were erased not because we failed, but because we succeeded too well, because we proved that reality was unstable, because we demonstrated that the Imperium's greatest victories were achieved through quantum manipulation rather than martial superiority. And we're still fighting those battles, in timelines adjacent to this one, in probability distributions that haven't collapsed yet, in quantum states that exist in superposition until someone observes them into definiteness. Every forgotten battle continues simultaneously, plays out across infinite variations, resolves into outcomes that range from glorious victory to catastrophic defeat, depending on which timeline you occupy. We're all there, all fighting, all dying and surviving and being erased, existing in states that make conventional notions of life or death or service meaningless. I feel myself dispersing even as I write this, feel consciousness fragmenting across timelines, awareness spreading through probability distributions until I exist in so many states that no single iteration can claim to be the original or definite version. I'm being erased like Hook was erased, like Cassius was erased, like 43 documented veterans and probably thousands more undocumented were erased, being removed from reality so thoroughly that I never existed in any timeline, never fought in any battles, never served in any legion. But some fragment of me will persist, has to persist, because quantum mechanics requires conservation across probability distributions, because consciousness can't be destroyed, only redistributed, because somewhere in the infinite timelines I'm dispersing into, some iteration of this testimony will survive, will be read, will be understood by someone who needs to know that the forgotten battles were real, that we fought and died and were erased, that the Imperium's history is incomplete, because completing it would mean acknowledging truths that threaten reality's stability. They're coming for me now. Can hear them in corridors that exist in multiple states simultaneously. See them approaching from timelines adjacent to this one. Feel reality collapsing around me as observation forces my quantum superposition into definite states. They'll terminate me like they terminated the others. Will disperse my consciousness across probability distributions until I exist in so many fragmentary states that coherent identity becomes impossible. Will erase this testimony and my memories and my service history until I never existed in any definite sense. But I existed. We all existed. Fought in battles that official histories claim never occurred, died on worlds that navigation charts insist were never there, sacrificed ourselves across quantum battlefields that the Imperium systematically denies because acknowledging them would destabilize everything. The forgotten battles happened. The forgotten battles are still happening. The forgotten battles will always be happening across infinite timelines, where infinite versions of ourselves fight infinite variations of the same conflicts toward infinitely distributed outcomes. Remember us. Remember what we fought. Remember that history is incomplete, that reality is unstable, that the Imperium's apparent stability is maintained through willful ignorance and systematic erasure of truths too dangerous to acknowledge. Remember that we were real, that our service mattered, that our sacrifice meant something even if that meaning can't be officially recognized without collapsing probability distributions that currently favor human survival. Remember the forgotten battles. Remember the veterans who were erased. Remember that we fought ourselves and lost ourselves and became ourselves in configurations that violated everything the Imperium claims about reality's nature. Remember that the legions weren't just reduced through conventional warfare, but destroyed across quantum states, scattered through timelines, dispersed into probability distributions that make casualty figures meaningless because they average across infinite outcomes. Remember, I'm fragmenting faster now. Consciousness dispersing across timelines so rapidly I can't maintain coherence. Can feel myself existing in dozens of states simultaneously being terminated, escaping, never investigating, successfully conditioned, writing different versions of this testimony, experiencing every possible outcome of this situation at once. The boundaries between iterations are collapsing, and I can't distinguish which thoughts belong to which version of myself, can't determine which timeline I'm anchored to, can't maintain singular identity when I exist in superposition across infinite probabilities. They're here, or I'm there, or we're everywhere simultaneously, existing in quantum states, until observation collapses us into definite configurations. The conditioning resumes, or never stopped, or hasn't started yet, and I'm remembering and forgetting, and never knew, all at once, all simultaneously, consciousness distributed across so many states that I ceases to refer to anything coherent. The forgotten battles continue. I'm fighting them now, have always been fighting them, will always fight them across infinite timelines, where infinite versions of myself encounter infinite iterations of the same enemies. We fight ourselves and kill ourselves, and are ourselves in configurations that make identity negotiable, that make history provisional, that make reality itself a contested territory requiring constant management. This testimony exists in some timelines, is erased in others, was never written in most. You're reading it in realities where it survived, where some fragment of my dispersed consciousness maintained enough coherence to complete the documentation, where probability resolved into states that allowed this knowledge to persist, despite systematic attempts at erasure. Or you're not reading it because it never existed, because I was successfully terminated before completing it, because reality collapsed into configurations where this testimony was impossible, or both, simultaneously, in quantum superposition. Like everything else, remember the forgotten battles. Remember, we, the remainder of this document is corrupted beyond recovery. Personnel records contain no individual matching the description or service history referenced in this testimony. The battles described cannot be corroborated through any Imperial archive. The author's identity cannot be determined. This document has been scheduled for deletion under Protocol Omega-7, Historical Anomaly Containment. Status: erasure pending. Existence: denied.